The last video brought us to the end of the 9th plague, but before Moses left the palace after Pharaoh's final threat, he has a message from God, and it's a dire warning of his own. The last plague that was yet to come wouldn't be a mere inconvenience or a discomfort. It would be the single most terrible fate of all. Every Egyptian firstborn would die, from the least to the greatest. For those opposing God, there would be no escape. And when Moses finishes his dire warning, he storms out in fury at the stubbornness of Pharaoh, because Pharaoh's personal pride would cause the whole of Egypt to suffer a grievous loss. But for his chosen people, God provided a way out. Chapters 12 and 13 break up the flow of the story a couple of times by introducing 2 new rituals that God would require for salvation from death. God gives Moses the instructions for 2 feasts, Passover and unleavened bread, which Moses then passes on to the people. Every detail of these feasts had to be observed, from the penning up of a lamb to the sprinkling of its blood on the doorposts, from the removal of leaven from the house to the complete consumption of the roast lamb. And finally, they were commanded to be fully clothed, ready to leave. This feast would mark the liberation of Israel from Egypt, their new birth, so to speak, and so God establishes this as the first month of the year. He calls it Abib, meaning new growth. Yet while Israel was celebrating their new beginnings, a terrible cry went up from the Egyptians. It was the same cry that Israel had cried when oppressed by their evil taskmasters. Now Egypt knew what it was like to lose their children. So Israel was hurriedly bundled out of Egypt with gifts of jewelry and treasures to speed them along, just like God had promised to Abraham over 400 years before. And finally, they were free. 2.5 million descendants of Jacob marching out of Egypt after nearly 215 years. When Israel reached Succoth, the story is interrupted again to remind Israel of the importance of the covenant of circumcision and to establish a new ritual, that every firstborn belonged to God and had to be redeemed by death. This was to remind them of their salvation in Egypt. And as Israel left Egypt, they were led by the angel of God's presence, which was represented in the pillar of fire and a cloud. And they were led through the way of the wilderness to avoid the warring Philistine tribes. They reach Etham, right on the edge of the wilderness. Only a few more steps and they'll be free from Egypt.
There are so many treasures to be uncovered in the symbols of Passover. Make sure you look into this. However, the gem that we found most thrilling from this section was about the daughter of Pharaoh, who was converted and left with the Israelites. Have a look at what her name means in 1 Chronicles 4, verse 18.
Here's a challenging question. Why does this section keep jumping between giving laws and instructions and telling the story of Israel's escape?
The Passover was immediately followed by the 7-day feast of unleavened bread. Mark this little diagram at the bottom of your Bible in Exodus 12.
This is the most personal section of Exodus. The Passover describes how we can identify with Jesus Christ to be saved from the inevitable death that we deserve. By relating to the perfect Lamb, Jesus, by entering into a new covenant by his blood, by staying inside the ecclesial house, we can be saved from death. Make sure you keep your own salvation in mind as you study the Passover.
Thank God for the beautiful gift that He has given in the offering of His Son so that you can be saved.